November 10th, 1943. The morning air at Rechlin hung cold and heavy as Hauptmann Hans-Werner Lerche circled the captured Republic P-47 Thunderbolt for the third time. The American fighter sat on the tarmac like a defiant monument to industrial excess, its wings stretched wide, housing something that would fundamentally alter his understanding of air combat doctrine. 8 Browning M2 machine guns, 4 per wing, 50 caliber, approximately 3,400 rounds of ammunition total. German intelligence had noted the armament configuration in their briefing documents. Of course, 8 guns. The number appeared in typed reports, was discussed in tactical assessments, was mentioned in pilot debriefings, but numbers on paper conveyed nothing about the reality of what those 8 guns meant in combat. Lerche had 50 minutes of fuel loaded for this evaluation flight. 50 minutes to understand why American escort fighters were cutting through Luftwaffe formations with a casualness that suggested not superior piloting, but superior firepower, employed with devastating simplicity. Within the next hour, Lerche would fire those 8 guns at a ground target range. The experience would shake him more than the aircraft's speed, more than its altitude performance, more than any other characteristic he would document. Because in 50 minutes, he would understand a fundamental truth that German fighter doctrine had missed entirely. The Americans had not built a fighter optimized for the elegant one-on-one dueling that characterized European air combat tradition. They had built an airborne weapons platform designed to destroy anything it pointed at through sheer volume of fire, and they had built it in numbers that made individual pilot skill increasingly irrelevant to strategic outcomes. By the time Lerche climbed out of the cockpit and walked toward the operations building to begin his report, he would know that the Luftwaffe faced something far more dangerous than a technologically superior opponent. They faced an enemy who had fundamentally rethought what a fighter aircraft should do and had the industrial capacity to make that vision unstoppable. Hans-Werner Lerche's path to this moment had been defined by an unusual combination of engineering precision and brutal honesty. Born in 1916 in Breslau, he had entered aviation through the glider clubs that flourished in Germany during the 1930s, when the Treaty of Versailles still prohibited powered military aircraft. These clubs produced a generation of pilots who understood aerodynamics intimately, who learned to read air currents and exploit energy management because they had no engines to compensate for mistakes. When Germany began its rearmament program, Lerche's skills and engineering education made him valuable to the expanding Luftwaffe. By 1939, he was assigned to Rechlin, the Reich Air Ministry's primary test facility, where his role was to evaluate everything that flew. New German prototypes, production modifications, and, increasingly, captured enemy aircraft. His logbook would eventually record flights in over 120 different aircraft types, from obsolete biplanes to cutting-edge jets. What distinguished Lerche from other test pilots was his refusal to soften his assessments for political convenience. When a German aircraft design was flawed, he documented the flaws. When an enemy aircraft was superior, he stated so clearly. This honesty had created tension with Nazi officials who preferred optimistic reports that confirmed German superiority. But Lerche's technical expertise was too valuable to dismiss. His reports were read because they were trusted, even when the conclusions were uncomfortable. The P-47 Thunderbolt, now waiting for his evaluation, represented the 4th intact American fighter captured by German forces. Previous examples had been damaged or had limited flight time available before mechanical issues grounded them. This particular aircraft, serial number 4222490, had an almost comical origin story that masked its significance. Second Lieutenant William E. Roach of the 358th Fighter Squadron had become disoriented during a bomber escort mission on November 7, 1943. Thick cloud cover and navigation errors had separated his flight, with fuel running critically low and breaks in the clouds revealing what appeared to be English countryside. Roach had landed at what he believed was a friendly airfield near the southern coast. Only after shutting down his engine and following a ground vehicle to a parking area did Roach realize his terrible mistake. The airfield was Cauve in occupied France. The ground crew approaching his aircraft wore Luftwaffe uniforms. Within minutes, Roach was a prisoner of war, and his aircraft, nicknamed Beetle, was German property. German intelligence had moved with unusual efficiency. Allied fighters regularly strafed German airfields, destroying captured equipment before it could be evaluated. Beetle was flown to Rechlin within days, repainted in Luftwaffe camouflage, and assigned the identification code T9+FK. Now it sat waiting for the methodical evaluation that would determine whether American fighter design represented a genuine threat or merely industrial quantity, compensating for qualitative inferiority. Lerche approached the aircraft with the systematic mindset of an engineer. External walk-around first. The P-47's construction quality was immediately apparent. Panel gaps were consistent. Welds were clean. Materials were high-grade throughout. This was not crude manufacturing. This was sophisticated mass production, which was a fundamentally different thing. German factories produced individual aircraft to high standards. American factories produced thousands of aircraft to high standards. The distinction was becoming strategically decisive. The wings drew his attention immediately. Thick, robust, built around a structural architecture that prioritized strength over aerodynamic elegance. 8 gun ports were visible, 4 per wing, positioned outboard of the propeller arc. Lerche knew from the intelligence briefing that each gun was a Browning M2, 50 caliber, belt-fed, capable of firing approximately 850 rounds per minute. Each gun was provided with approximately 425 rounds of ammunition. German fighters typically carried 1 or 2 cannons, supplemented by machine guns. The Messerschmitt Bf 109G6, the Luftwaffe's primary fighter, mounted 120mm MG 151 cannon firing through the propeller hub and 2 13mm MG 131 machine guns above the engine cowling. Total ammunition capacity was approximately 350 cannon rounds and 600 machine gun rounds. German doctrine emphasized precision. Cannon shells were devastating when they hit, but ammunition was limited and required careful marksmanship. The American approach appeared fundamentally different. 8 guns meant massive ammunition expenditure. The intelligence briefing suggested American pilots were trained to fire in sustained bursts, relying on volume of fire to guarantee hits. German pilots were trained to fire short, precise bursts to conserve ammunition. Which philosophy was correct depended on what you were trying to achieve. If the goal was elegant aerial dueling, the German approach made sense. If the goal was reliably destroying targets regardless of pilot skill level, the American approach had merit. Lerche climbed onto the wing and settled into the cockpit. The spaciousness struck him immediately, as it did every German pilot transitioning from Bf 109s or FW 190s. American designers had prioritized pilot comfort for extended missions. The seat was well padded, visibility was excellent through the high canopy, everything was within easy reach without straining. This was a workspace designed for 8-hour missions at high altitude, not the cramped cockpit of a German fighter where long missions became physically exhausting. The armament controls were clearly labeled. Gun charging switches, 8 of them, 1 per gun, allowed the pilot to clear jams individually without disabling the entire armament system. The gun sight was straightforward, a simple reflector sight that required no complex calculations. Point the illuminated reticle at the target, fire, adjust, based on tracer observation. The system was designed for simplicity and speed, not precision marksmanship. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Lerche worked through the pre-flight checklist methodically. The manual was comprehensive, explaining every procedure in detail with clear warnings about critical steps. German manuals assumed pilot expertise, American manuals assumed pilot ignorance, and compensated with thoroughness. The philosophical difference was revealing. Germany trained elite pilots and accepted high training casualties. America trained adequate pilots in large numbers, and designed aircraft that forgave mistakes. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine started with a deep, powerful rumble that vibrated through the entire airframe. 18 cylinders, 2,000 horsepower, turbo-supercharged for high-altitude performance. Lerche noted the smooth idle immediately. American engines ran with a consistent smoothness that German engines, particularly late in the war, increasingly lacked. Manufacturing tolerances and quality control made the difference. This engine sounded like it could run forever. Taxiing to the runway, Lerche experienced the P-47's ground handling characteristics. The wide landing gear made the aircraft stable. The tailwheel locked, preventing unwanted directional changes. Visibility over the nose was adequate. Everything about ground handling was straightforward and forgiving. The Bf-109, by contrast, had narrow landing gear that made the aircraft twitchy on the ground. Inexperienced pilots frequently ground-looped during taxi or landing, damaging aircraft even without enemy action. The Luftwaffe accepted these handling challenges as the price of high performance. The Americans had designed for operational reliability. Lerche received clearance and advanced the throttle. The acceleration was impressive, the massive engine pushing the heavy fighter forward with authority. The takeoff run was longer than a German fighter, but not excessively so. The aircraft lifted smoothly, and Lerche retracted the landing gear. Initial climb rate was good, not exceptional, but consistent and predictable, passing through 3,000 meters, then 4,000. Lerche noted the aircraft's changing character. The turbo-supercharger maintained engine power as altitude increased, delivering performance that improved where German fighters began suffering in the thinner air. At 6,000 meters, the P-47 felt stronger and more responsive than it had at low altitude. This confirmed the intelligence assessments. The Thunderbolt was designed for high-altitude escort missions, not low-altitude combat. But Lerche's primary objective for this flight was not altitude performance. That could be documented later. Today's mission was weapons evaluation. He needed to understand what 850 caliber machine guns meant in practical combat terms. Rechlin's gunnery range was located 20 kilometers northwest of the main airfield, a section of forest where ground targets had been established for weapons testing. Lerche contacted range control, received clearance, and turned toward the test area. The target was a standard Luftwaffe fighter silhouette, wood and canvas construction, positioned at the edge of a cleared area. Lerche would make multiple passes at varying distances to document accuracy, effect on target, ammunition consumption, and gun reliability. He climbed to 2,000 meters, positioned the aircraft for a diving attack run, and began his approach. The gun sight was simple to use. The illuminated reticle projected onto the windscreen, providing an aiming reference that required no calculation. Lerche lined up the first pass, a shallow dive from 2,000 meters to 1,000 meters, target angle approximately 30 degrees, airspeed building to 500 kilometers per hour. At 800 meters range, he pressed the gun trigger. All 8 guns fired simultaneously. The aircraft shuddered, not violently, but noticeably. The recoil from 850 caliber machine guns firing in unison created a vibration that transmitted through the entire airframe. Tracers arced toward the target, a stream of fire that appeared almost solid in its density. Every 5th round was a tracer, marking the trajectory of the rounds. The visual effect was spectacular. The target disintegrated. Lerche released the trigger and pulled up, processing what had just happened. He had fired for approximately 2 seconds. In that brief moment, the 8 guns had collectively fired more than 250 rounds. The target, which would have required multiple precise cannon hits from a German fighter, had simply ceased to exist as a coherent structure. Pieces of wood and canvas were scattered across 30 meters of ground. He repositioned for a second pass, this time from a more difficult angle, a beam attack that required deflection shooting. German pilots trained extensively in deflection gunnery because cannon ammunition was precious and hits had to count. Lerche lined up the crossing shot, led the target by the appropriate amount, and fired another 2-second burst. Again, the sustained roar of 8 machine guns. Again, the visible stream of tracers. But this time, Lerche observed something crucial. Even with imperfect aim, Enough rounds reached the target area to cause significant damage. The volume of fire compensated for aiming errors. A German pilot attempting the same shot with cannon would likely miss entirely, the few shells passing ahead or behind the target. The American pilot, spraying 250 rounds in 2 seconds, would score multiple hits, even with mediocre marksmanship. Lerche made a third pass, this time firing a longer burst of approximately 4 seconds, 500 rounds downrange. The sound was unlike anything he had experienced in a German fighter. The sustained hammering of 850 caliber guns created a noise that dominated all other sensations. The recoil was steady and manageable, not the sharp kick of a cannon, but a continuous vibration that required only minor control input to compensate. The ammunition counter showed he had expended approximately 800 rounds across 3 passes, roughly 25% of the total ammunition load. In a German fighter, that number of rounds fired would represent nearly the entire ammunition supply. In the P-47, it was a quarter of available firepower. American pilots could fire longer bursts, engage multiple targets, or make multiple attack passes before exhausting ammunition. German pilots had to make every burst count because ammunition was gone after 30 seconds of firing. But it was the target effect that truly concerned Lerche. He descended to low altitude for a close inspection of the gunnery range. The silhouette target no longer existed as a recognizable object. It had been reduced to scattered debris, pieces no larger than a man's hand, spread across the impact area. Surrounding trees showed impact damage from rounds that had missed the primary target, but still struck with devastating effect. And Lerche understood immediately what this meant for bomber defense. A Bf-109 attacking a B-17 bomber formation needed to close to very short range and place cannon shells in critical areas, the engine, cockpit, or control surfaces. Each attack run risked collision and exposed the fighter to defensive fire from multiple bombers. A pilot might get 1 or 2 good shots before needing to break away, and if those shots missed or failed to hit critical areas, the bomber survived. A P-47 escorting those bombers could fire from greater range, spray the attacking German fighter with sustained fire, and rely on sheer volume to score hits. The German pilot had to be precise. The American pilot had to be adequate. In the mathematics of attrition warfare, adequate firepower in large numbers beat precision firepower in small numbers. Lerche climbed back to altitude and conducted additional firing passes, testing the guns under various conditions, high-speed dives, turning engagements, high-altitude, thin air. The guns functioned flawlessly in every scenario. No jams, no malfunctions, no failures. The 8 charging switches meant that even if one gun did jam, the pilot could clear it individually without affecting the others. German fighters with centrally mounted cannons had no such redundancy. A jam meant no firepower until landing. The reliability was remarkable. Lerche had experienced enough German fighter evaluations to know that weapons malfunctions were common, particularly in cold, high-altitude conditions. The Browning machine guns continued functioning without issue, despite the temperature and air pressure changes. This reliability reflected manufacturing quality and design maturity. The Browning M2 had been in service since the 1920s, refined through decades of use. The system was proven, tested, and perfected. After 40 minutes of weapons evaluation, Lerche retained enough fuel for some basic maneuvering tests before returning to Rechlin. He climbed to 8,000 meters and explored the aircraft's handling characteristics while considering what he had learned about the armament. The P-47 was not agile in the German sense. It did not turn tightly. It did not have the instantaneous response of a Bf-109 or FW-190, but it did not need to be agile in that traditional way because its armament philosophy was different. A German fighter needed to maneuver into a precise firing position, hold that position briefly, and fire a short burst of cannon shells. The entire engagement depended on positioning and timing. The P-47 could afford to be less precise. Its 8 guns created a cone of fire wide enough that approximate aim was sufficient. A German pilot needed to be exactly on target. An American pilot needed to be approximately on target. The American pilot could fire longer, make more attempts, and adjust based on tracer observation. The German pilot had, perhaps, 3 seconds of total firing time before ammunition was exhausted. Lerche understood that he was not simply evaluating an aircraft. He was confronting a completely different philosophy of air combat, one that reflected American industrial capabilities and operational thinking. Germany built fighters for skilled pilots who could exploit performance advantages through superior maneuvering. America built fighters for average pilots who could win through sustained firepower and numerical superiority. Which approach was superior depended entirely on context. In a fair fight between expert pilots, German fighters had advantages, but wars were not fair fights between experts. Wars were grinding campaigns of attrition where the side that could sustain operations longest usually won. And the Americans had designed their fighters for exactly that kind of war. Lerche returned to Rechlin and landed. The flight had lasted 53 minutes, slightly more than planned, but within fuel margins. He taxied to the hangar where ground crew and intelligence officers waited for his assessment. They gathered around as he shut down the engine and began his post-flight inspection. "What did you think, Herr Hauptmann?" one of the intelligence officers asked. "Is it as crude as the reports suggest?" Lerche climbed out of the cockpit, removing his flight gloves. "The aircraft is not crude. The armament is devastating." The officer looked confused. "We knew it had 8 machine guns. That was in the briefing." "Knowing it and understanding it are different things," Lerche replied. "When you fire 8 50-caliber guns simultaneously, you're not aiming at a target, you are creating a zone of destruction. Anything in that zone is hit multiple times. The volume of fire compensates for aiming errors." "But our cannons hit harder," another officer objected. "One 20mm shell does more damage than a 50-caliber bullet." Lerche nodded. "True, but you have to hit the target first, and you have perhaps 30 seconds of cannon ammunition. The American pilot has 90 seconds of machine gun ammunition and needs less precision to score hits. Which pilot is more dangerous, the one who must be perfect or the one who merely has to be adequate?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Lerche continued his thought. "We train our pilots to be perfect. We design our aircraft for experts. The Americans design for mass production and mass training. They accept that most pilots will be average, so they give those average pilots tools that do not require expertise. 8 50-caliber guns mean that an inexperienced American pilot can be as dangerous as a veteran German pilot. That is the strategic threat." The intelligence officers exchanged glances. This was not the assessment they had expected. The briefing had emphasized the P-47's weight and size as disadvantages. Lerche was describing the armament as a revolutionary advantage. "How many rounds did you fire?" one officer asked. "Approximately 1,200 rounds," Lerche said. "Still had about half ammunition remaining. I destroyed the target completely with the first few bursts. The rest was testing reliability and accuracy under various conditions. All 8 guns functioned perfectly. No jams, no failures." That evening, Lerche sat at his desk in the Rechlin operations building and began composing his technical report. The standard format included sections on performance, handling, systems, and strategic assessment. But for this evaluation, the armament section would dominate the analysis. He wrote carefully, knowing that his conclusions would be controversial. German military culture emphasized quality over quantity, skill over simplicity. The idea that American mass production philosophy might be strategically superior contradicted fundamental assumptions about warfare. But Lerche had learned that uncomfortable truths were still truths, and his responsibility was accuracy, not reassurance. The captured aircraft mounts 8 Browning M2 50-caliber machine guns, 4 per wing, positioned outboard of the propeller arc. Each gun is belt-fed with approximately 425 rounds, providing total ammunition capacity of 3,400 rounds. Rate of fire per gun is approximately 850 rounds per minute. During weapons evaluation, all 8 guns were fired simultaneously in multiple bursts, ranging from 2 to 4 seconds duration. Recoil is noticeable, but manageable, creating steady vibration rather than sharp impulse. The pilot can maintain accurate aim during sustained fire. Tracer observation allows real-time adjustment of aim point. Guns functioned flawlessly in all tested conditions, including high altitude, high speed, and maneuvering flight. No jams or malfunctions were experienced across approximately 1,200 rounds fired. The volume of fire from 850 caliber guns is extraordinary. A 2-second burst delivers approximately 250 rounds to the target area. Standard fighter silhouette target was completely destroyed by first burst. The concentration of firepower creates an effect area rather than a point target. Even with imperfect aim, sufficient rounds strike the target to cause catastrophic damage. The Messerschmitt Bf 109G6 mounts one 20mm MG-151 cannon and two 13mm MG-131 machine guns. Total ammunition provides approximately 30 seconds of firing time. The Focke-Wulf FW-190A mounts 2 to 4 20mm cannons plus machine guns with similar limited ammunition. German armament philosophy emphasizes large caliber weapons that cause maximum damage per hit but require precise aim and careful ammunition management. The P-47 represents opposite philosophy. Medium caliber weapons in large quantity, accepting reduced per-hit damage in exchange for dramatically increased hit probability and sustained firing time. A German pilot engaging bombers must close to short range and place cannon shells precisely in critical areas. Each attack run provides perhaps 5 seconds of firing opportunity. If the pilot misses, he must disengage, reposition, and attempt another pass while under defensive fire from multiple bombers and escort fighters. An American escort pilot defending those bombers can engage German fighters from greater range, fire sustained bursts while maneuvering, and adjust aim based on tracer observation. The American pilot requires less skill to achieve lethal effect. This has profound implications for training efficiency and operational effectiveness. Lerche paused, considering how to phrase his next observation. It was the most important conclusion, but also the most likely to be dismissed as defeatist. The P-47's armament represents a force multiplier that compensates for pilot skill disparities. An inexperienced American pilot with 8 50 caliber guns is as dangerous as an experienced German pilot with limited cannon ammunition. As the war progresses and our pilot training program deteriorates due to fuel shortages, this disparity will become increasingly significant. The Americans can afford to train pilots to adequate competency rather than expert proficiency because their aircraft armament does not require expert marksmanship. We cannot afford this luxury. Our aircraft requires skilled pilots to be effective, but we are increasingly unable to provide the training time necessary to produce skilled pilots. German fighter armament philosophy must be reconsidered. Current doctrine prioritizes large caliber cannons that require precision marksmanship and provide limited ammunition. Consider increasing machine gun armament to provide sustained fire capability that does not depend entirely on pilot skill. Additionally, improved reliability and ammunition capacity should be prioritized in future fighter designs. The fundamental question is whether we are designing fighters for our best pilots or for our average pilots. If we design for experts, our combat effectiveness declines as expert pilots are killed and replaced by inadequately trained novices. If we design for average pilots, our overall force effectiveness remains more consistent. The Americans have chosen the second path. They have built a fighter that average pilots can fly effectively. We should study this approach carefully. Lerche signed the report and dated it November 10th, 1943. He knew that his conclusions would be read with skepticism, possibly dismissed as the overreaction of a test pilot impressed by enemy technology. But the truth was simple and undeniable. 8 50 caliber machine guns, fired simultaneously with adequate reliability and generous ammunition capacity, changed the mathematics of air combat. The next morning, Lerche's report entered the German military intelligence system, where it would be read, discussed, and ultimately filed with other captured aircraft evaluations. Some officers found the conclusions alarming, others dismissed them as exaggerated, but few understood the deeper implication of what Lerche had identified. The Americans had not simply built a well-armed fighter, they had built a fighter whose effectiveness did not depend on pilot skill as the primary variable. In a grinding attrition war where experienced pilots died and were replaced by novices, that distinction was strategically decisive. By mid-November 1943, Lerche's report on the captured P-47 had reached operational commanders throughout the Luftwaffe fighter force. The response was mixed and revealing. Veteran pilots who had encountered P-47s in combat nodded grimly at Lerche's conclusions. They had experienced firsthand the wall of fire that American fighters could deliver, but staff officers and doctrinal planners were more skeptical. The objections followed predictable patterns. German cannons delivered superior hitting power per round. German fighters were more maneuverable. German pilots were better trained. These advantages had won air superiority in Poland, France, and the early stages of the Eastern Front. Why should they suddenly become irrelevant? Hauptmann Theodor Rosarius, commander of the Special Evaluation Unit that would eventually bear his name, understood Lerche's point immediately. Rosarius had spent months studying captured Allied aircraft and had developed a sophisticated appreciation for how design philosophy revealed strategic thinking. The Americans were not trying to build superior aircraft in the traditional sense. They were building adequate aircraft in overwhelming numbers, designed to be effective in the hands of average pilots. Rosarius ordered the captured P-47 transferred to his demonstration unit, where it would be used to educate frontline pilots about what they were facing. The aircraft, still bearing its German markings T9 plus FK, became the centerpiece of a traveling roadshow that visited fighter bases across Germany and occupied Europe. The demonstrations followed a standard format. Rosarius, or Lerche, would brief assembled pilots on the P-47's characteristics, emphasizing not just performance data, but tactical implications. Then they would conduct demonstration flights, often mock combat against German fighters, to illustrate specific points. The armament demonstration was always the most dramatic part of the program. A target would be set up on the airfield perimeter, visible from the briefing area. The P-47 would make a firing pass, and pilots would observe the effect of 8 50 caliber guns from a ground perspective. The visual impact was profound, as the sustained roar of the guns, the visible tracer stream, the complete destruction of the target, all combined to create an impression that technical briefings could not achieve. After one such demonstration at a fighter base near Munich in late November, a veteran Bf-109 pilot approached Lerche with a troubled expression. "I shot down a P-47 2 weeks ago," the pilot said. The American pilot was clearly inexperienced. Poor formation discipline, predictable maneuvers. But before I got him, he nearly got me. I could not understand how such a poor pilot could be so dangerous. Now I understand. It was the guns. Lerche nodded. The guns compensate for skill deficiencies. That is their purpose. An average pilot becomes dangerous because he does not need to be perfect. He just needs to point approximately in the right direction and fire. Volume compensates for precision. "But we are better pilots," the German pilot objected. "We have better training, more experience. That matters. It matters less than it did." Lerche replied, 2 years ago, we had air superiority because we had better pilots flying better aircraft. Now the Americans have adequate pilots flying aircraft that do not require excellence to be effective. The advantage shifts to the side that can sustain operations with average resources rather than requiring exceptional resources. The philosophical implications were difficult for German pilots to accept. Luftwaffe culture emphasized individual excellence. Aces were celebrated, their kill counts publicly announced, their tactical innovations studied and emulated. The idea that superior individual skill might be losing relevance contradicted fundamental beliefs about what made a fighter pilot effective. But the mathematics of attrition were undeniable. By late 1943, the Luftwaffe was losing experienced pilots faster than the training system could replace them. New pilots arrived at frontline units with minimal flight time, inadequate gunnery training, and no combat experience. These novice pilots, flying precision-demanding Bf-109s, were slaughtered by American pilots who might be equally inexperienced, but were flying fighters that compensated for their inexperience. An average German pilot in a Bf-109 struggled to employ the aircraft's capabilities effectively. The cannon armament required precise aim. The limited ammunition demanded careful fire discipline. The challenging handling characteristics punished mistakes. An average American pilot in a P-47 could be effective simply by following basic tactical procedures: point the nose at the target, fire sustained bursts, adjust based on tracer observation. The aircraft's armament made competency lethal. Throughout December 1943 and into early 1944, the Circus Rosarius demonstrations continued at fighter bases across Germany. Lerche flew dozens of evaluation flights in the captured P-47, accumulating over 40 hours in the aircraft. Each flight reinforced his initial assessment. The armament was the key feature, the characteristic that made the aircraft strategically significant despite its limitations in traditional dogfighting. The reliability of the guns particularly impressed Lerche. German fighters suffered increasing weapons malfunctions as the war progressed, and quality control deteriorated in stressed manufacturing facilities. Cannon feed mechanisms jammed, electrical firing systems failed, ammunition quality varied between production batches. Pilots reported frequent situations where weapons failed at critical moments. The P-47's Browning machine guns continued functioning flawlessly across dozens of test flights in varying conditions: cold temperatures at high altitude, high G maneuvering, sustained firing. The guns simply worked, consistently and reliably. This reliability reflected decades of design refinement and manufacturing expertise. The Browning M2 was a mature weapon system, proven through extensive military and commercial use. But it was during a mock combat demonstration in January 1944 that Lerche experienced the most profound insight into what the P-47's armament meant tactically. He was flying the Thunderbolt against two FW-190s piloted by experienced instructors. The scenario simulated an escort fighter defending bombers against interceptors. The German fighters had advantages. They were more maneuverable. They could turn tighter, accelerate faster at low altitude, and exploit angles that the heavier P-47 could not match. By traditional air combat doctrine, the German fighters should have won the engagement easily. But Lerche had one advantage that changed everything. He did not need to maneuver perfectly. He just needed to get approximately into position and fire. During one engagement, an FW-190 came out of a turn behind him. In a real combat situation, the German pilot would have had perhaps 3 seconds of firing opportunity before the P-47 could maneuver defensively. The German pilot would need to aim precisely, fire a short burst, and hope for hits. Lerche reversed hard, not turning inside the German fighter, which was impossible, but reversing toward him, accepting the head-on geometry. In that brief moment of mutual visibility, Lerche pressed the trigger. 8 50 caliber guns fired simultaneously. Even though this was a mock engagement with no live ammunition, the tactical reality was clear. The FW-190 pilot would have flown through a storm of fire, even with imperfect aim. Enough rounds would have converged on the German fighter to cause catastrophic damage. After landing, the FW-190 pilot was shaken. "I had you," he said to Lerche. "I had position, I had angles, I had everything I needed, but you did not care. You just turned into me and opened fire. If this had been real, we both might have died, but you would have killed me first because your guns would have hit me before I could fire precisely enough to hit you." "That is the tactical reality," Lerche replied. "The P-47 pilot does not need to win the maneuvering fight. He just needs to survive long enough to bring his guns to bear approximately on target. Volume of fire compensates for poor positioning. This changes everything about how air combat works." The demonstration had profound effects on the German pilots watching from the ground. They understood instinctively what Lerche was illustrating. Their tactical advantages, their superior maneuverability and performance mattered less when the enemy could afford to fight crudely and still win through firepower volume. German doctrine emphasized elegant tactics, energy management, angle fighting, precise positioning. These skills took months or years to master. American doctrine, as Lerche was coming to understand it, emphasized simpler tactics. Get into approximate position, fire sustained bursts, use overwhelming firepower to compensate for imperfect execution. These tactics could be taught in weeks. By early 1944, operational reports from frontline units confirmed what Lerche's evaluation had predicted. American P-47 formations were cutting through Luftwaffe interceptors with disturbing efficiency. German pilots reported encounters where they achieved favorable positions but could not capitalize because the Americans would simply reverse aggressively and fire massive volumes of ammunition that made precise German cannon shots irrelevant. One particularly revealing after-action report came from a Bf-109 pilot who had survived an engagement with P-47s over Western Germany in February 1944. "I achieved perfect positioning behind an American fighter," the pilot wrote. "I fired my cannons at close range, perhaps 150 meters. I observed hits on the fuselage and wing, but before I could fire a second burst, his wingman reversed into me and opened fire with all 8 guns. I was forced to break away immediately. The volume of tracer fire was like flying into a wall. I do not believe he was aiming precisely. He was simply filling the airspace with bullets. Several rounds struck my aircraft. I was fortunate to escape." This pattern repeated across dozens of engagement reports. German pilots achieved tactical positions that should have been decisive but were unable to exploit them because American defensive tactics relied on overwhelming firepower rather than precise maneuvering. The 8 50 caliber guns allowed American pilots to fight effectively even from disadvantaged positions. The strategic implications were becoming undeniable by spring 1944. The United States was producing P-47s at extraordinary rates. By early 1944, production exceeded 300 aircraft per month. The Luftwaffe was destroying American fighters, but replacement aircraft and pilots appeared faster than combat losses accumulated. More troubling still, American pilot quality was not declining, despite rapid expansion. The training pipeline produced adequate pilots consistently. These pilots were not aces, but they did not need to be aces. They flew aircraft designed to be effective in average hands. The P-47's armament meant that an American pilot with 50 hours of training could threaten a German pilot with 300 hours of experience, because the engagement outcome depended less on pilot skill than on firepower availability. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Lerche continued his evaluation work throughout early 1944, flying the captured P-47 and other Allied aircraft to provide intelligence that might help German pilots survive. But he was increasingly aware that his reports were documenting German decline rather than providing solutions. The problems were systemic and strategic, not tactical. Better tactics could not overcome industrial disadvantages and resource constraints. During one particularly frank discussion with intelligence officers in March 1944, Lerche was asked directly whether German fighters could compete with American escort fighters in the long term. His answer was carefully worded, but pessimistic. "Our fighters are qualitatively superior in traditional metrics," he said. "We have better maneuverability, better performance at low and medium altitude, better acceleration in certain flight regimes, but the Americans have designed fighters that do not compete in those traditional metrics. They compete in operational effectiveness and sustainability. The P-47 is not the best fighter in a dogfight, but it does not need to be. It has adequate performance, devastating armament, excellent reliability, and, most importantly, it exists in numbers we cannot match. The Americans produce more fighters in 1 month than we produce in 3 months. Their pilots are adequately trained. Their aircraft are reliable. Their armament is overwhelming. We are fighting the wrong war. We are optimizing for individual excellence when the Americans are optimizing for systematic effectiveness. In a long war of attrition, systematic effectiveness wins. The officers received this assessment in uncomfortable silence. Lerche was stating what many German commanders had begun recognizing, but few wanted to acknowledge. Germany could not win an industrial war against the United States. The production numbers were too disparate, the resource advantages too overwhelming. The captured P-47 continued serving demonstration duties through spring and summer 1944, but its intelligence value had been exhausted. Mid-year, the Luftwaffe understood American fighter capabilities thoroughly. The problem was not lack of knowledge. The problem was lack of solutions. German fighters could not be redesigned quickly to incorporate lessons from American aircraft. The industrial base was under increasing strain from Allied bombing. Material shortages forced compromises in manufacturing. Quality control suffered as experienced workers were drafted and replaced by forced laborers. Even when German engineers understood what needed to change, implementing changes was increasingly difficult. The armament disparity was particularly difficult to address. Increasing German fighter firepower meant adding weight, which degraded performance. German fighters were already operating at the limits of available engine power. Adding more guns without more powerful engines would create aircraft that were even less competitive, but more powerful engines were not available. Engine development programs were years from producing combat-ready power plants that could support heavier armament. The Americans faced no such constraints. Their industrial base was untouched by bombing. Their resource supplies were unlimited. Their production facilities operated at maximum efficiency. When American designers wanted more firepower, they simply designed larger airframes around larger engines and manufactured them by the thousands. By August 1944, the air war over Europe had reached a decisive phase. American bombing raids penetrated German airspace daily, escorted by hundreds of P-47s and the newer P-51 Mustangs that combined P-47 firepower with even greater range. The Luftwaffe's fighter force was in collapse, not because German pilots lacked courage or skill, but because the operational environment had become unsustainable. German fighters sat grounded for lack of fuel. New pilots received minimal training because fuel for training flights was unavailable. Experienced pilots were killed faster than replacements arrived. Aircraft production could not keep pace with combat losses. The industrial advantages that Lerche had identified in his November 1943 evaluation had compounded into overwhelming American superiority. The captured P-47 flew its last demonstration mission in September 1944. By that point, the aircraft's condition had deteriorated due to lack of proper maintenance and spare parts. American components could not be manufactured in Germany, and captured spare parts were unavailable. The aircraft was grounded and eventually scrapped, its intelligence mission complete. Hans-Werner Lerche survived the war through a combination of skill and fortunate timing. As a test pilot rather than a combat pilot, he avoided the grinding attrition that killed so many Luftwaffe fighter pilots. He continued evaluating captured Allied aircraft through the war's final months, including British Spitfires, Soviet Yak fighters, and eventually the revolutionary P-51 Mustang. His report on the P-51 would echo his P-47 assessment. The Americans had refined their approach, combining devastating firepower with extended range and improved performance. The lessons they had learned from P-47 operations had been incorporated into an even more effective fighter. The trajectory was clear. American fighter design was evolving systematically, each generation incorporating lessons learned and improving on proven concepts. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Lerche was interrogated by Allied technical intelligence officers who found his reports in captured German files. They were particularly interested in his P-47 evaluation, which had accurately predicted how American escort fighters would dominate European airspace. "Your assessment was remarkably prescient," an American officer told Lerche during one interrogation session. "You understood what we had built before our own pilots fully understood it. The armament made it obvious, Lerche replied. 8 50-caliber guns represented a completely different philosophy of air combat. Not precision dueling, but overwhelming firepower. Once I understood that distinction, the strategic implications were clear. Did German commanders understand this? The officer asked. Some did, Lerche said, but understanding and responding are different things. We lacked the industrial capacity to compete with your production. We lacked the resources to match your training pipeline. We lacked the strategic depth to absorb losses and continue fighting. Your fighters were effective because they were part of a complete system. Good aircraft, adequately trained pilots, overwhelming numbers, reliable logistics, all integrated into sustained operations. We could match individual pieces of that system, but not the complete system. The interrogation revealed broader patterns. Multiple German technical experts had recognized American advantages early in the war, but had been unable to influence strategic decisions. Reports were filed, briefings were given, recommendations were made. But the fundamental reality of industrial disparity could not be overcome through tactical innovation or doctrinal revision. In his later years, Lerche wrote extensively about his experiences as a test pilot, including detailed accounts of flying captured Allied aircraft. His memoir, published in the 1970s, provided technical assessments and personal reflections on what those evaluations had revealed about the nature of modern warfare. His chapter on the P-47 focused heavily on the armament, describing in detail the experience of firing 8 50-caliber guns simultaneously and the tactical implications of such overwhelming firepower. He wrote candidly about how that 50-minute evaluation flight had changed his understanding of what made a fighter aircraft effective. The P-47 was not the most elegant fighter I ever flew, Lerche wrote. It was not the fastest at low altitude. It was not the most maneuverable. But it might have been the most effective, operationally, because its effectiveness did not depend on having exceptional pilots. It was designed to be dangerous in average hands. That design philosophy, more than any specific technical feature, made it strategically significant. For historians studying the air war over Europe, Lerche's P-47 evaluation provides valuable insights into how tactical intelligence translated into strategic understanding. His report accurately identified the key characteristics that made American fighters effective: overwhelming firepower, excellent reliability, and design philosophy that prioritized operational sustainability over peak performance. But Lerche's evaluation also reveals the limitations of tactical intelligence. Understanding enemy capabilities did not automatically translate into effective countermeasures when broader strategic constraints prevented implementation. Germany understood what it was facing, but lacked the resources to respond effectively. The production numbers tell the story most clearly. The United States manufactured 15,683 P-47 Thunderbolts during the war. Peak production reached 1 per hour, 24 hours per day, from multiple factories. Germany produced approximately 36,000 single-engine fighters total across all types during the entire war, and German production faced constant disruption from bombing and resource shortages. The armament disparity compounded the numerical advantage. Each P-47 carried 8 50-caliber guns with 3,400 rounds of ammunition, providing approximately 90 seconds of firing time. A typical Bf-109 carried 1 cannon and 2 machine guns with approximately 30 seconds of firing time. The American pilot could fire 3 times longer from more guns with less need for precise aim. The multiplication was devastating. More aircraft, each more heavily armed, each more reliably constructed, each designed to be effective with less pilot skill. The cumulative effect created air superiority that individual German tactical excellence could not overcome. For the families of veterans who participated in this conflict, the story of Lerche's P-47 evaluation illustrates how technological and industrial factors shaped combat outcomes. American pilots flew fighters that gave them advantages beyond their individual skill. German pilots fought bravely with inadequate resources. The outcomes were determined by systems and capabilities, not just courage and determination. The captured P-47 that Lerche flew in November 1943 represented more than one aircraft. It represented the culmination of American industrial philosophy applied to military aviation: build adequate aircraft in overwhelming numbers, design for operational reliability rather than peak performance, prioritize firepower volume over precision, train adequate pilots rather than waiting to train experts. These principles contradicted traditional military thinking that emphasized quality over quantity and individual excellence over systematic effectiveness. But in the grinding attrition of total war, systematic effectiveness proved decisive. Lerche's 50-minute evaluation flight had revealed this truth immediately. The 8 50 caliber guns were not just armament. They were a philosophy made manifest. They represented American confidence that overwhelming firepower could compensate for tactical imperfection. They embodied industrial capacity to provide ammunition in volumes that German manufacturing could never match. They demonstrated design maturity that came from decades of refinement rather than rushed wartime development. When Lerche pressed the trigger and felt 8 guns fire simultaneously, he understood immediately that he was experiencing something that would change air warfare. Not because the guns were revolutionary in themselves, the Browning M2 was an old design, but because mounting 8 of them in a single fighter and providing ammunition to sustain fire represented a completely different approach to combat. German fighters were scalpels, precise instruments that required skilled hands to be effective. The P-47 was a hammer, crude perhaps by comparison, but devastatingly effective when applied with adequate force, and the Americans had thousands of hammers with pilots trained to swing them adequately. The lesson that emerged from Lerche's evaluation extends beyond World War II tactics to encompass broader questions about military technology and strategic planning. Sophisticated technology and highly trained personnel provide advantages only if they can be produced and sustained in sufficient quantities. Excellence that cannot be replicated at scale loses to adequacy that can be mass-produced. The Americans understood this instinctively. They did not try to build the perfect fighter. They built good enough fighters in overwhelming numbers. They did not try to train every pilot to be an ace. They trained adequate pilots systematically. They accepted that most engagements would be won by competency and firepower rather than brilliance and precision. Germany's approach was opposite. Build the best aircraft possible. Train pilots to expert levels. Rely on quality advantages to overcome numerical disadvantages. This philosophy worked when German quality advantages were substantial and resource availability was adequate. But as the war ground on and resources became scarce, the philosophy collapsed because excellence could not be sustained at necessary scales. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.